Now that demand for freedom of conscience then becomes one of the most consistent, the most consistent demand in the Levellers' proto-constitutions, the agreements of the people. Discussions of the vote itself ebb and flow, and the Levellers seem prepared to trim their sails as far as the franchise is concerned. But in the case of liberty of conscience, that remains the bedrock of certainly what the Levellers see as being essential to the agreements of the people. And that's actually what leads Milburn then to repudiate the form of the agreements finally presented to Parliament in 1649. It's not watering down any elements to do with the franchise, it's the way in which they're watering down religious toleration and making that less expansive. That's important in terms of the story of the development of liberty generally in this country, because that demand for freedom of conscience is part of the so-called reserves of the agreements of the people. Now these were rights that couldn't be abrogated either by the legislature, by Parliament, or by the political executive. And they couldn't be abrogated because they were essentially natural rights. So nobody should be able to take these away, is the Leveller argument. So we move to this position, move away from that medieval position where rights and freedoms are gifted by particular charters or particular documents like Magna Carta, to where rights are actually inalienable. Rights like freedom of conscience are human rights that are inalienable, moving us towards that modern liberal conception of freedoms from, Isaiah Berlin's famous phrase, freedom from having your conscience impinged upon. Now, this is all connected to arguments for freedom of expression and freedom of the press. My mention of Areopagitica earlier, I think, will indicate. And the Levellers themselves, obviously, here are using print, using that breakdown of ecclesiastical censorship in the 1640s to circumvent that intellectual monopoly that the Church had previously had, and to make these more radical claims, to bring them forward. But we need to recognise here the way in which those claims remained heavily contested. There's often a sense in which certainly the later 17th century is seen as a watershed, and we move towards, because of things like the Toleration Act in 1689, because of the lapsing of various licensing acts, we move towards a tolerant, open society. And in fact, that is not the case. It's much more a case of ebbs and flows. 1695, the Licensing Act lapses. 3 years later, Parliament passes a new Blasphemy Act to, again, limit freedom of religious expression. And as we've seen, radicals in the 19th century, like Carlyle, like William Hone, fall victim precisely to this legislation. Now, Ben Wilson's book on Triumph of Laughter has sort of celebrated William Hone as a sort of pioneer of freedom of the press, and certainly that victory that he had in 1817 against those charges of blasphemy was a great propaganda coup. But it did not have a kind of lasting impact onwards from that. The general attack on the press in that decade was very effective. And I think when we see the way in which blasphemy legislation has been used in the 19th century and onwards into the 20th century, we can see that it has continued to limit our general freedom of expression. That limitation on the use of satire that Hone ran into was still something that, the Monty Python team were running into in the late 20th century again. So what I want to just sort of recap there, suggest is that although this is very important in terms of the story of the development of liberty, it's also one where we have to recognise the limitations of the liberty that was achieved, the actual kind of boundaries of that. But even that limited statutory toleration, even those limited achievements made by freethinkers and radicals, by nonconformists, had important ramifications for radicalism itself, because they provided spaces for the intellectual development of radical ideas, for the expression of radical ideas, and for the communication of radical ideas. In terms of education, that Anglican monopoly on education was challenged by the creation of dissenting academies. Of course, in London, the most famous ones being in Hoxton and Stoke Newington, the places where Richard Price, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin received their education. Paine, of course, was brought up was educated as a Quaker, and that had an important impact on the way in which he wrote and expressed himself, the way in which he didn't use the classical rhetoric that so many of his peers did, but instead used an open, uncluttered style that helped his works become so popular. They also provided, this toleration provided spaces and resources that could be exploited by radical groups. The toleration extended to Unitarians in 1813 was used by London ultra-radicals who noticed that if they obtained licences as Unitarian preachers, they could thereby avoid the limitations on political meetings, because no similar limitations applied to dissenting meetings, so they were thereby free to meet up and actually discuss radical politics under the cover of being Unitarians. And Chartists, even though as we've seen they have this sort of ambivalent or antagonistic relationship with dissent, often used non-conformist meeting houses as places for political meetings. In the very broadest sense, I think religious freedom, freedom of belief, and political freedom in the broadest sense go hand in hand. Control over our own bodies is perhaps that most fundamental freedom. And as I'm sure many people here are aware, Bradlaugh, aside from being a Republican and an atheist, was also an advocate of birth control and sex education, another thing which made him very, very unpopular. And that's continued to be a feature of humanist thought on into the 20th century. Humanists in the 1930s, obviously, being very active in that regard. I think this interconnectedness, and I realise I've talked for a long time, so I'm going to kind of try and wind up, this interconnectedness between republicanism, radical politics, and humanism and atheism continues to this day. And obviously one example of this is the fact that I was invited here when I was giving a talk at Republic's conference, and Alice and John were here as well. So I take it that there is some overlap there between Central London Humanists and Republicanism. So, and I think there's a reason for that. In the same way that I think present-day Republicans would argue that we can't really have proper citizenship without a Republican constitution. So I think humanists would argue that we can't be proper citizens if we don't really separate religion from the state, if we don't really have it's the acknowledgement of a truly secular state. So I want to return finally to my word, atheism, and the problems with it, and return to that British Social Attitudes Survey. I think one particularly annoying example of the way in which we really haven't yet reached that point where church and state are neatly separated is the way in which, despite the fact that we have got this large proportion of people who say they don't believe in God, we very rarely hear those sorts of opinions in the media. The Archbishop of Canterbury, despite his ever-dwindling number of active believers, is regularly asked to give his thoughts on the issues of the day. So various other leaders of even smaller faith groups, but you rarely hear the voices of humanists, for example, with their opinions on particular issues. And again, I think it comes back to that idea, that pejorative sense of atheism as something lacking. You're missing something. It's not that you've got your own conception of the world, it's that you're waiting for something to come along. You're waiting for the right religion for you to appear. So I think those who complain about stridency of some humanist spokesmen, for example Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, are probably the ones that come most to mind, are really ignoring the extent to which that tone itself, I think, is a product of a 21st century Britain in which it is still difficult to say that you don't believe in God, to say that you're an atheist. At best, I think atheism remains a bit of an embarrassment. At worst, it still seems to be seen as a dangerous and socially divisive non-belief. So, as far as I can see it, to be an atheist is still to be a radical.
Thank you, Edward, very much. It's a very enlightening talk, I'm sure everybody will agree, and apologise for having to cope with those noisy students next door as well. Is that what it is?
Yeah, they're young French radicals.
Young French radicals?
Yeah, they didn't understand me, or they ignored me.
You touched on a lot of topics there, and before we open it up to Q&A, I wonder if I could ask a quick question. The title of your talk, Sometimes It's Hard to Be an Atheist. I also think that sometimes it's very easy to be an apathetic atheist.
Yeah.
So coming back to somebody like Paine, the ideas he was talking about were well known in educated circles. It wasn't the first time those people had heard of those ideas. But what scared the people in charge was that, his background as a pamphleteer, he was spreading it widely, it was cheap and easily available. Yeah. Now, what can we learn from people like Paine in today's environment, where it's still easily accessible to learn about what atheism is, but we really need somebody championing it and why it's important to view atheism as something positive.
Yeah. Well, I think you do have people championing it now who are doing it successfully. And obviously, I mentioned Dawkins, and I know people. He divides people in the same way that I think Paine divided people. I think that you're raising an interesting point there, which isn't quite your question, but I'm going to talk about it anyway because it's interesting to talk about it. Which is you're talking about it's easy to kind of have an apathetic or a lazy non-belief, and of course this is one of the issues with a survey of that kind is how many of that 43% do really have a kind of cogent, coherent sense of themselves as as secularists, as humanists, and how many of them just aren't, not sure, don't care, and that's it. And that's the same problem as well if you're kind of looking at this question over a longer period of time, which is that it's quite easy to find examples of, if you like, irreligion, of people who don't seem to care too much about it, or even kind of thumb their nose at religion. But that isn't necessarily the same thing as somebody having a really kind of fully fleshed out idea of what it means to be a humanist or an atheist or a secularist. I think that there does need to be a development, and I think this is often the criticism of humanism, is to develop, to have that kind of popular edge that somebody like Paine does, somebody like Dawkins does, but also to be able to bring forward, if you like, that positive vision as well as the pointed critique. As you say, the kind of critiques that Paine was making of Christianity were not in any way new. So I think it's that aspect that is still difficult, and that may be because there are all sorts of different humanists, and it's hard to kind of agree on some kind of core there. In the same way, there are all sorts of different Christians. So I think that's the tricky bit. There are lots of ways in which humanists can sort of make good criticisms of the negative impact of religion in public life and the problems with it and so on. But I think it's harder to come out with a kind of coherent, positive vision.
Excellent. Well, we're going to open it up to the floor.
That's why I recommend his speciality is he uses resident imagery whilst people are